All right. Well, welcome, Aaron.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. I would say let's start off with the first question that I have for you, which is your background in philosophy. So, could you fill us in on what your background is in regards to the discipline of philosophy?
Sure. So I've taught ethics and philosophy, introductory philosophy for 10 years now. And originally, I didn't start out with an interest in philosophy. I got that a little bit later as I started taking college classes. Started off as an economics major. And during the process, I read Mere Christianity. I got really interested in philosophy, started questioning all the views that I had previously had as a child, realized my brain was developing and some of the views I previously held probably didn't pass the muster. So I went through this process of testing all the beliefs that I had and trying to see what would actually survive. And that's when I got really interested in philosophy in general and made a YouTube channel where I also talked about Christianity, things related to that. And then philosophy became my obsession. So I minored in philosophy, ended up going to get the master's in philosophy after that, and I haven't looked back since.
Awesome. Besides C.S. Lewis and reading Mere Christianity, are there any other philosophers that really shaped how you view philosophy in general?
Some of my favorite philosophers actually are the ones that are antithetical to the beliefs that I hold dear. I like the ones that challenge me. So I actually haven't read as many of the philosophers that are kind of pro Christianity or pro my team as you might expect. Instead, I read a lot of the other philosophers that are more challenging. One of my favorites is David Hume, also a big fan of Nietzsche. So basically, people who've had the antithesis of the conclusions I end up actually holding to.
Yeah, no, I think that's really healthy to be able to entertain ideas and different ideologies that you yourself don't hold because it prevents you from making straw man arguments of the opposite side. So you're actually engaging with like their top people. So I respect that a lot. You also mentioned your YouTube channel. What is your YouTube channel and where else can people find you if they're interested in what you have to say?
Yeah, so mainly through YouTube. I make a lot of Facebook posts as well, but those are more just for friends. My YouTube channel was originally called Epidemic 2020. That did not age too well when the pandemic came around. So now my new name is Test Everything 521. And that's actually a reference to what I say at the end of all my videos, which is basically just a quote of First Thessalonians 5:21, was test everything, hold on to the good. It kind of just mirrors that process that I think we should all go through at some point where we test all our beliefs and keep the good ones.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. Definitely challenge everything. But have you ever challenged the fact that you have to challenge everything?
Yeah, so I've had I think there's a concept of faith that comes up a lot and how people understand it, whether you should believe things blindly, that kind of thing. I definitely come down onto the rejection of what's often called fideism, this kind of belief that things are should be trusted blindly. I think if you do any testing at all, that's one that quickly comes up as one that's worthy to discard.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. So, out of all of the videos or Facebook posts that you've made, what's one piece of content, if you could give us some insight, that would really explain the majority of your views and why you do what you do? Like, is there one video or one Facebook post that would really communicate to the world why you do what you do?
Hmm. I'm not sure that I have a kind of archetypal piece of information out there. A lot of the things are related to things that I believe about Christianity, but sometimes it's just random stuff like explaining the naturalistic fallacy or getting into some in the weeds problem about Gettier and epistemology or something like that. But the thing that probably is most central to my beliefs would be the series I have on the moral argument. So I talk a lot about morality, and I do think that that ends up connecting with religion in some way that I find pretty interesting. So I spend a lot of time talking about those type of topics.
Do you have any specific formulation of the moral argument that you like? Because for me personally, out of all the arguments for God, that's the one that I use the least. But I know that a lot of people find it extremely compelling, and I'm very curious about why they find it compelling. So, what formulation do you normally go to?
Yeah, I the classic formulation are like the one that William Lane Craig made popular. I don't really have any objections with that particular phrasing of it. I might tweak it myself a bit, and I think I have actually done a slightly different version of it. But ultimately, I think it comes down into the persuasiveness of that argument depends on how well you explain the various premises, not on necessarily how you actually word them. So you gotta reach common ground with folks about what morality is and why they should accept belief that morality is objective, for example. And then after you have that sort of foundation, you go from there. But it's really only meant to appeal to people that already have a belief in objective morality, or you convince them that that's the case.
I was just about to bring that up. Like, how would you approach somebody who does not believe that there are quote unquote moral facts in the universe? Like, obviously, you would approach them very differently than if somebody that already has the assumption that there are moral facts. So, how would you demonstrate that?
This is one of the things I really enjoy about philosophy. So I taught an ethics class forever, philosophy 220. And what's really cool is when you start off, the students, almost none of them believe in objective morality. They have their own views. A lot of them are very keen on relativism or some version of that. And as we go through the class, and this is a trend, it's not just for this one particular topic, but we'll give the best arguments in favor of relativism, and then we go through a series where we give the best arguments against it. And the students all typically end up switching teams rather quickly and abandoning relativism. I think a lot of people believe in objective morality without actually realizing it, like their views are internally inconsistent. That happens over and over in the philosophy class. Like when we talk about utilitarianism, all of a sudden they're all on board. And then when we critique it, they all end up abandoning it. So there's this constant flow where they end up being persuaded over and over again and kind of becoming more skeptical that they actually understand things by the end of the semester. But that process is really cool. And I think it's useful to be able to evaluate those kind of beliefs. But I think ultimately, objective morality is actually a lot easier to argue for than you would originally realize.
How would you critique the approach where intuition exists, therefore an objective moral intuition automatically applies? So, for instance, if somebody has a subjective opinion of something, if you have a subjective, you automatically get an objective because it would be objectively true that they subjectively hold that opinion. Now, you can have objectivity without subjectivity, and that's what we would want to, argue for in regards to morality. But what would you think about the approach to where if somebody is a relativist and they only believe in subjective opinions or cultural opinions, they still objectively hold that opinion? So I don't know. Yeah, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
The explanation I offer to the students is subjective claims are actually I claims in disguise. Like, I like broccoli is a subjective claim because the subject, I, is the one that's doing the thing. And then there's a statement like broccoli contains, and then I state whatever nutrients are in there. That would be an objective claim because it's a claim about an object. Claims about objects, objective. Claims about subjects, subjective. When we're making moral claims, this is a field called metaethics, the question is, what does the word good mean? Is it an I claim? So when I say slavery is bad, am I merely saying I dislike slavery? Or am I saying slavery is actually bad? Like it's bad even if I personally enjoyed it. And I think I think you can make a really compelling case that it's actually the latter.
What if somebody said, they'll say, I like broccoli, which is subjective, but would they be correct to say that it's objectively true that they like broccoli?
I can treat myself as an object and say it's factually true that I like broccoli. But I think you can also get that same person to make a claim like this. Slavery is wrong, even if I like it. And if you ever catch yourself and there's a number of different ways to do this, but if you ever catch yourself saying something is wrong, even if it's liked, that can't be a subjective claim. And this is not specific to Christianity, but there's a couple of specific traps towards a relativist. There's things they can't say about morality. And if you get them to say any of those things, it means that they're not consistent or they just aren't a relativist.
Yeah, no, that's right. It just comes from the relativist worldview, I suppose. And speaking of worldviews, you alluded to the fact that your worldview is Christianity. So what vein of Christianity, I suppose, and what's the evidence that you found extremely compelling for Christianity, and why do you hold that view?
Yeah, so I'm not really too concerned about denominations of Christianity. I was raised in a Baptist household, so I actually don't hold all the Baptist views anymore, but some strand of Protestantism is where I'd end up landing. The evidence for Christianity, I think there's actually a pretty compelling series of arguments. They're kind of like strands of an individual rope. It's going to take the form of they're classically called a moral argument, a teleological argument, perhaps a cosmological argument in there in some form as well. I think most folks have a rudimentary understanding of those ideas. Like teleological arguments about it seems like the world is designed, so there must be a designer. The actual argument is going to be more complicated than that, but I think a lot of people have an intuitive grasp of that kind of concern or that kind of thought. I think when it comes to, so there's a case that can be made to show that Christianity is likely true, or at least some sort of theism is likely true. And when we look at the main contenders on which religion would actually be the case, I think it's way more likely that Christianity ends up passing the test than its main competitors like Judaism or Islam or Mormonism or something along those lines. So there's really multiple steps in that can get kind of complicated, but I think if you do the hardcore examination of all the views, Christianity ends up on top.
Yeah, no, I agree. It seems that you would need to start with, yeah, some sort of generic theism or deism just to establish that there is some sort of supernatural being. And you can do that through teleological arguments or cosmological arguments, which aren't just one argument. Those are families of arguments. There's a lot of different versions underneath those umbrellas. And then from there, you could add extra arguments that would build off of those foundations to get more specific to Christianity itself. Because like a cosmological argument could be agnostic about whether or not Islam or Baha'ism or Christianity were true. But as you get more specific to like more Christian arguments, let's say the resurrection, then you would start to be able to differentiate between them. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, well said.
So according to the Christian worldview, why do you think we're here? Like, what are human beings' main purpose?
So I think, and this is a slightly different interpretation of one of the verses than most folks would give, but I think we're made to be God's image bearers on earth. So we're designed to carry his flag, so to speak, and imitate him. I think that because he is good, the thing that he designed us to do is also good and ends up also being a fulfilling thing to be. So it's not merely the fact that we're designed, but I do think that our design ends up being kind of what we're here to do and what our purpose for being is.
So now that we have that in line, how do we know what is right and wrong? Like, how do we know how we're abiding by what God wants us to do based upon our design and why we are here?
So I think all human beings come with, I'm an ethical intuitionist. That's a position in philosophy that kind of argues, and this is very commonly misunderstood, what in the world ethical intuitions refer to. But it's essentially this idea that we're born with an inbuilt understanding that there are certain things that are right or wrong. Now, the moral intuitions we come with are like subconscious, hardwired principles we can have access to, but they don't solve the moral dilemmas for us. So just because you have moral intuitions doesn't guarantee you have the correct moral conclusions. It just shows you that there is a right and wrong out there to be sought after. It doesn't tell you like how different values are to be weighted when they conflict with each other, for example. So it's not going to solve all our moral problems for us, but it's definitely enough to get us understanding that we have a conscience that shows us right and wrong exists. And then through wisdom and experience and argumentation, we can perhaps come closer to understanding moral truths. Some of the moral truths, by the way, aren't so controversial. It's the ones we focus on are the controversial ones. But like we shouldn't kill non-consenting people for fun is a pretty obvious one that is the case. I think there was another part of that question I might have skipped over.
No, I think you got it. I think you got all of it. You did make a quick comment that I was interested in. So, do you think it would be appropriate to kill somebody who did consent? Because it seemed like you put the value on that, on just whether or not something is consented to or not. So I'd love to hear your
Yeah.
thoughts.
So the only reason I get really specific there is because when it comes to morality, we are willing to be pedantic. And when it comes to other areas, we tend not to be. So if I was to say a phrase like water freezes at 32 degrees Fahrenheit, you probably wouldn't challenge me. You probably wouldn't say, oh, well, not if the water's moving or not if the water's mixed with salt. But if I say something like killing people for fun is bad, you would then say, oh, what about in self-defense? What about in a just war? What about if killing them, I can harvest their organs and save 10 other people? And we come up with all these extra circumstances that might make it more morally ambiguous. It's not a game we tend to play in science, but it is definitely the kind of game played in morality. So one way to avoid those type of problems is just to be really specific. In my economics classes, they would make claims like, if you do this to supply, here's what happens to demand, ceteris paribus, meaning all things being equal. Like, don't go come up with other variables that are changing and make the question change. There's not really in morality a ceteris paribus where I say like killing is bad, ceteris paribus, all things being equal. So instead, to avoid that, you just get really specific.
And then, since we were talking about how do we know what is right and wrong, do our moral intuitions or actions dictate where we end up in the afterlife if there is an afterlife? And if there is, how do we know that there is an afterlife?
So my beliefs about an afterlife are entirely like second tier, using my own terminology there. And what I mean by that is I'm first and foremost convinced Christianity is true. And because Christianity is true and mentions an afterlife, or like heaven, then that's why I believe in heaven. So it's entirely dependent on Christianity. If I stopped being a Christian, I would also stop believing in an afterlife. Like I didn't independently arrive at the conclusion via investigating people's afterlife experiences or coming back from the dead or having sensations of heaven or hell or something like that. My belief in the afterlife isn't dependent on those things. It's literally entirely because I believe Christianity is true. So all of my beliefs about the afterlife are coming from just Christian sources like the Bible.
So, if Christianity were false, would you jump to another religion that has an afterlife, or would you just say the whole thing is just preposterous and you would become something like an agnostic or an atheist or something?
Um, So one of the issues with jumping to a different religion is that I spend a lot of time thinking about the other religions and I have found them very wanting. So I'm not too sure that I would end up jumping ship to a different version. Maybe some like type of deism or something might be particularly more persuasive. Um, but the belief in afterlife really is dependent on the religious sources that I currently believe have truth within them. So if I stopped believing that Christianity was true, I would have to come up with different reasons for sustaining the belief in afterlife.
Okay. Regarding how you know Christianity is true, what do you think are the most effective epistemologies or ways of knowing things to establish those beliefs?
Hmm. Well, I think epistemology is kind of independent of whether, like, it doesn't have anything to do with the religion. It's just you come up with, you have an understanding of what epistemology is, how to have true beliefs, how to have the most rational beliefs, and and either your religious view ends up passing the test or not. For the longest time, almost all the philosophers agreed on the definition of what knowledge was. They considered it justified true belief. In the 1960s, this guy named Gettier came along and poked a hole in that particular definition. So now it's fractured, and most philosophers actually have a modified version of that view. So it's now, yeah, I won't get too into the weeds on that, but essentially it became a little bit more confusing. Um, the justified true belief version of epistemology is probably good enough for most conversations. I actually think the entire endeavor of epistemology, trying to find out what is knowable, is the study of knowledge. I think what we actually end up doing in practice is trying to figure out which beliefs are rational or which beliefs are not rational. And that we conflate the rational beliefs with what knowledge is. And I think our conversations about what knowledge is are way more productive. Sorry, our conversations about what's rational to believe is way more productive than our conversations about what can be known for sure. So learning things about which beliefs are justified, which beliefs are rational, how to avoid biases, how to make sure that you're not coming to reject consensus when you shouldn't, or put too much stake in your own ability to reason. All of those type of things I think are super important, and what's usually going on when people are trying to do epistemology.
All right, yeah, let's get into some like Gettier cases and what definition of knowledge you specifically hold. So, like you said, Gettier essentially wrote a paper, and it really just turned various epistemologists against each other because they all had like radically different views of how to answer Gettier's thought experiments. Like, if I'm remembering correctly, one of the thought experiments were that, I don't know, some guy named Bob was going for a job interview, and he thought Jane was going to get it, and Jane had 20 cents in her pocket. So he's saying that the person who gets this job has 20 cents in their pocket. That's his belief. And Jane doesn't get the job, and he gets the job, and unbeknownst to him, he actually has 20 cents in his pocket. So would that count as like a justified true belief? Why or why not? And why is this so controversial in regards to epistemologists who argue over this all the time?
Yeah. Gettier cases are a little bit tricky to understand at the very beginning. Perhaps an easy way to start is to realize that justified true belief is like Plato's definition of knowledge, and it's the one that was dominant for forever. So justified means you have a really good reason for holding the belief that you do, and then it has to just be a belief that is also true. And you can make your own Gettier case very easily. You just come up with an example of a justified true belief, like I saw a sheep in a field, there was a sheep, and then you just make it false by accident. You trick them somehow. So instead of being a real sheep, it was just a picture of a sheep. So I saw the sheep, so I have justified knowledge. It was a belief, but then it wasn't true. You accidentally made it false. And to make the Gettier case, you just make it accidentally true again. So you make the real sheep hiding behind the fake sheep. And then I end up with a justified true belief, but my justification is like accidental. It's only true by coincidence. So in your example, the 20 cents in my pocket was justified. It was a true belief, but it seems accidentally true. And if you come up with that example, you can get an example of something that is a justified true belief, but doesn't feel like it should count as knowledge. So it needs to be like JTB plus something else. And other philosophers have tried to define that something else as warrant or added some extra term to the mix. And it's always an external trait, something that we don't have control over, and we'd have no idea whether it holds or not. Could be our senses are properly functioning. Like, are they or are they not? I don't know. But that would be the condition, this external force that determines whether we actually have knowledge or not. And that becomes an issue that people grapple with. I have my own kind of way of trying to dodge that particular problem or of attempting to solve it. But there's actually some other issues with JTB that folks aren't typically concerned about, that is actually at the forefront of my mind of something that I really grapple with, that makes it hard for me to fully accept that theory.
I'd like for you to go into detail about your specific way around these. I think that'd be interesting, or like your specific theory.
Okay, so well, the first thing is, I think that arguing about knowledge itself is the mistake. I think trying to have justified beliefs is pretty much as all we can do. So instead of trying to argue about do we have knowledge or do we not, the argument should really be about, is your belief rational or is it not? And then you just try and have the most rational beliefs, because that's the only proxy you have for whether or not you're likely to hold a true belief or not. Just try to hold the most rational belief, and that is literally the best you can do at any point in time. And it would be irrational to reject the views you hold that are rational to believe. That would be going against the evidence. So really the conversation is unduly focused on this other thing, and instead of focused on what we can actually have, which are reasonable beliefs. And that entails part of the problem. If you end up focusing on this harder to obtain thing, that's where skeptics will come in and say, oh, you can't actually have knowledge or something along those lines. And then the conversation ends up going into the weeds about things that are not direct experiences. But with that set aside for a second, if I am going to defend the kind of JTB, or justified true belief definition of knowledge, all you have to do, in my mind, is make sure that a T, the truth aspect, is actually an external factor. So you can have a justified and you can have a belief, but whether the belief is actually true or not is actually outside of your control. And it may be possible that through forces beyond your control, I trick you and I make your justified belief end up being false. You can always make a Gettier case as long as you recognize that the truth is an external condition and justification isn't directly tied to the truth. It's hopefully tied to the truth, but you can never know that for sure. So all you need to do to solve the Gettier cases is come up with a definition of J that necessarily connects it to T, right? That your justification is the reason it holds true. So you have to build in the J has to be intertwined with the T in some way, or else you'll always have a Gettier case, no matter how much extra things you add to it. Even if you add something like warrant to the definition of knowledge, unless that's intertwined with the T as well, I'll be able to make up another Gettier case.
I'm interested how somebody would be able to do that, because I think it might devolve into a category error, because the justification or how you know something is different than whether or not the belief is true or not. Like, you could have an irrational belief that is true. So something is true, like you said, like ontologically in a sense, like it's just objectively true. And the justification would be like your epistemology of how you arrived at that and how you know that. But just like, I don't understand how to intertwine them in the sense of like they're one and the same. Like, I would think that almost is like a category error.
I mean, the folks that try to intertwine the justification and the truth value would say something like, um, your belief that you have 20 cents in your pocket was like accidentally connected to the truth of it. You need it to be not an accident. And if we can remove that accidental relationship to truth, then you would avoid Gettier cases in some way.
Well, what do you think of this? I would just say that Bob is wrong. Bob thought that Jane, who has 20 cents in her pocket, was going to get the job, but Jane did not get the job. So, in that sense, I think he's right in one way, or partially correct, but it seems that his thought process breaks down because Jane herself, the subject, didn't get the job.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's wrong with just calling these Gettier cases just like just false? What if somebody has a false belief and they give justification for it, and then they're mistaken about something in their logic, and that thing that they're mistaken about turns out to be accidentally true, but that doesn't mean their entire thought process was correct, if that resonates. Like, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. I think you can actually have some Gettier cases where that's the case, where you can show that the justification is actually false, the thing that they're believing. But you can also modify a Gettier case to make it so that it's more specific and doesn't have that particular flaw. Because the Gettier case has this formula where you just find any justified true belief, and then you make it become false and then make it become true again accidentally. So you'll, at any specific Gettier case, you might be able to come up with an example of why the justification isn't true or why there's a mistake. But you can actually come up with really specific ones where you can kind of try and avoid that mistake.
Do you think you could have knowledge about something that's false?
Um, by definition, no.
And that's how the vast majority of like philosophers would agree with that position. So I'll just give an example. So if I have knowledge about Islam and the Quran and their tafsir and hadith and their sunnah, do I have knowledge about Islam?
Yes.
But Islam is false. So do I have knowledge about something that's false?
I think in the same way I can like know Harry Potter is a wizard, even though Harry Potter's not real. It's not. There's nothing about the claim Harry Potter is a wizard that entails that Harry Potter actually exists. So it's not entailing the truth claim Harry Potter is real.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. Do you think that there's some like a mismatch in this parallel to where we're comparing fiction, which is false in one sense, which is something that is factually false in another sense?
Um,
Like, I could say that it's true that Harry Potter went to Hogwarts, but I mean that in a fictional sense.
mhm.
But when I say something is true or false about Islam, I'm specifically saying it's true or false in regards to reality and not fiction.
I mean, maybe, but when I talk about Islam, or when a textual critic would talk about Islam, they'd be talking about it in the same way that they might be talking about a fiction, of like, here's the beliefs that this particular view holds, without any conclusion that therefore those beliefs are accurate or true.
What about like a polemicist who was just trying to say that Islam is false for XY reasons, but they would need to know things about Islam in order to say those things? But it seems that if they can only have true beliefs or true knowledge about something that is true, then somehow they don't really have any knowledge about Islam.
Well, the claim of like Muslims believe Muhammad is a prophet, right? That's a claim that is true, and its truth doesn't depend upon anything about Islam being true or being an accurate reflection of what God is like.
Yeah, but so their knowledge would be false, but they would still have that knowledge. Like, does that resonate? Like, it's knowledge about something that is false.
I think I see what you're trying to get at here, but that particular proposition is about something that is true.
Explain that more.
So if I just have the phrase, Muslims believe Muhammad is a prophet, that's a proposition, and all the statements in that proposition are true.
Use it like, let's just rephrase the example. We'll use the same terminology, but let's just make an objective statement about it. It's like either Muhammad is or is not a prophet. somebody believes, or let's just, you could even make an interpersonal. It's like, I believe he is not a prophet, or they believe that he is a prophet. There is truth value attached to those things. So it's
Mm-hmm.
either somebody has false knowledge, so to speak, because they think something that's false, but they have knowledge. They have knowledge about Muhammad. So it seems that they would just have like false knowledge, so to speak. They know something, but what they know is false.
Yeah, I mean the classic JTB definition precludes you from saying that you have false knowledge because
That's right.
the T is built into the word knowledge. So perhaps if you offer a different definition of knowledge, you could make that sentence make sense. But given the JTB version, it just doesn't.
So what would you call their thoughts then? Like the people who believe that Muhammad is a prophet, you would agree that they are mistaken, but somehow that information is not knowledge. So like how would you approach that?
I mean, this might be just a conflation of that whole subjective objective thing again. When I'm making a claim about what Muslims believe, I'm making a claim about them, not a claim about the truth of their religion. So if I'm saying Bob believes Muhammad is a prophet, that's a statement about Bob and his beliefs, and it happens to be true. But it's not a claim about Islam per se, like the factually existing thing.
That's the point I'm trying to draw out. We're just taking Islam as a worldview, and the worldview is false. But I can have knowledge about that false worldview. Does that like resonate? It would seem odd to say to somebody that yes, Islam is false, but you have no knowledge of it. Does that like it sounds a little odd to say. What are your thoughts? I don't want to hark on this for too long.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can add more to what I've my position as it already stands.
That's fair. Can we know anything with absolute certainty, or is all knowledge provisional?
So I have a huge problem with the concept of absolute anything, really. But I think absolute certainty itself is a category. Actually, certainty in general is the category error that people always conflate when it comes to knowledge. So we're talking about like which beliefs are rational or which beliefs are known. And then we're talking about certainty. And the irony is that your level of psychological certainty is totally independent upon the evidence available for a thing or the rationality for believing a thing. And it is really common for people that are the most absolute certain about a position to be holding the most absolutely ridiculous positions. So you can have psychological certainty in the absence of having good reasons to believe a thing at all. And in another twist of irony, just because you have really good reasons to believe in a thing doesn't mean you're psychologically certain of it at all. Like you could have the most trustworthy, faithful wife on the planet, and you could still be riddled with unreasonable doubts and lack of certainty in their trustworthiness. So those are two totally different things, and certainty has really nothing to do with proper justification. It should be connected to your level of justification, but in practice, it just does not.
Yeah, no, I completely agree that certainty is just a psychological state of mind, and it doesn't really reflect on what is and is not the case, so to speak. So it sounds like you're almost like a fallibilist in the sense of like all knowledge is fallible and there is nothing like do you think we can know anything that is beyond debate essentially? And debate's the wrong word, or revision is maybe a better word.
Yeah, I mean, there's a category of things called incorrigible beliefs that are really, really hard to poke any holes in. And if there's any candidates for a belief that you can take it to the bank and you'll never be wrong about, it'd probably be those. Those feel almost like a cop out. Like even I think therefore I am is an example of one of those. It's a description of like how you feel or and actually that might be a tautology in itself. So coming up with those, there might be some examples of things that escape scrutiny, um, but they're not like the standard propositional claims like the external world is real or something like that that we'd actually really like to know. There might be some foundational incorrigible beliefs that do pass that test.
So you would also believe in like self-validating beliefs as well, like something that is definitionally true.
Definitionally true things don't convey any information at all. So it's like saying circles are circular. Like, yeah, it's true. It just doesn't add to my knowledge in any way. So yeah, there are things that are true by definition. All bachelors are unmarried, but it's not propositionally useful. It doesn't increase my knowledge of things in the real world.
If somebody doubted those things, would they be useful then?
I don't. They're literally incapable of doubting those things because the way in which we reason is governed by laws of logic, and you have to reject the laws of logic to reject those things that are true by definition. So I don't think it's actually capable. I think that's actually the thrust of why it was so compelling when Descartes says, "I." It's actually "I doubt, therefore I am," instead of "I think, therefore I am" is the original phrasing. It's like the very act of trying to doubt was impossible to do.
But it seems like doubt would also just be a psychological state, which I would think that certainly they can doubt. They would just be making an error somewhere, but surely they could doubt something that's true by definition.
I mean, I guess you can, but with a logical inconsistency in place, with some irrational thing occurring. The incorrigible beliefs feel like a bit of a cop out. It's really a description of my own experiences. So, like, even if I'm dreaming, I can still say, like, I felt heat. And because it was a dream, like whether it's real or not or corresponds to reality anyway, it's true that I felt the thing. So, you can't really doubt my feeling of the thing. But I'm not sure how useful that is. If we're really just trying to come up with beliefs you can't doubt, I felt heat might suffice, but I'm not sure how useful it is.
When do you think it's okay to trust experts, and then when is it okay to doubt them?
So, um, this is a caveat I'm tempted not to make, but not all experts are equal. Like some fields lend themselves to tremendous amounts of evidence, and some fields inherently limit them or are relying on more speculation. So if you have much less sources and you're trying to make an archaeological find, the experts might not really know what they're talking about. But in general, if we're talking about like evolution or some topic that has experts with lots and lots of evidence, then usually it's a good idea if you're trying to place your bets on something and figure out what's most likely to be true to trust the experts. However, any topic that you actually understand, because the whole force of the experts is really just on the evidence they're appealing to. You can always doubt the experts, especially the better you understand the source material. The question that I would have, or the concern that I would have, is human beings are very bad at eliminating their own biases and evaluating things rationally and choosing to do so at a good time. So if my prior beliefs lend me to or make me want to think that evolution is false, for example, then I might be really likely to distrust the experts before even really looking at the evidence. And I might have an inclination to trust the people that end up rejecting the scientific consensus. So it's difficult. It requires wisdom and experience, and also requires time to investigate the claims yourself. You could be rational in withholding judgment. That would be a reasonable stance to take. But I find most humans are very quick to either accept the consensus or to reject it, and our reasons are not always the best.
I definitely agree that all experts are not equal, and all disciplines are also not equal in regards to their evidence or what they can point to. So I would be interested to know if the philosophy of something disagrees with the science of something, which would you side with?
I'm not sure of a practical example of that kind of thing happening. Like the first thing that comes to my mind, you can let me know if this is totally off base, but I read lots of books about ethical intuitions, and it's not from people that are ethical intuitionists. It's from like evolutionary psychologists who are studying how human beings and other animals have a conscience, a with knowledge, or something along those lines. Like Moral Minds is an example of that, of a book that I read from an evolutionary psychologist perspective. He has a particular philosophy that maybe not even consciously, but he's definitely advocating a philosophy, which is not the one that I hold to, in order to explain the evidence he's coming across. Now, I think that portion of the book is super weak. So the conclusions he's drawing about philosophy, awful. The observations he's making about different species or human beings and bonobos or something, how they have moral intuitions, that's fine with that part, just the conclusions that he draws from it. So I don't necessarily trust the scientists themselves when they go outside of their expertise to comment on philosophy to be as good at it as when they're commenting specifically in the lane where they're expert in.
Yeah, in that case, I would just say that perhaps he's confusing anthropology and psychology with epistemology and ontology. But just like a thought experiment, I might not have a practical thought experiment to give you, but let's just say on a given topic, topic X, the philosophers are in the majority of agreement that the answer is Y, and the scientists get together and they say that the answer is Z. Which would you put more weight on?
I think the correct answer in something like this is not to just we put weight on one and we kind of follow the trend due to our own lack of time. The correct answer probably is to withhold judgment until you look at a complicated issue and try and use your reason to figure out which one actually has the best evidence.
Let's say they both have compelling evidence in their respected field, but in this instance, let's say like it's dire that you make a decision. Like, which one would be more authoritative? And again, you can just pass on the question if you want.
I mean, if they're both well evidenced, then it seems rational to believe either one.
So it sounds like you're saying that philosophy and science are both equal in regards to their evidential ability to lead you to
I'm
truth.
just not really sure there's a difference between those things. There certainly wasn't a difference between philosophy and science at the beginning. Philosophy just means the love of wisdom. So if you were doing math, you were doing philosophy because you were learning, you were being wise about some particular topic. So I don't know if there's this category where philosophers only reside. And if you do come up with a category where the scientists and the philosophers are different and the philosophies aren't influenced by the scientific findings, then perhaps that's not the thing I would even identify as philosophy in the first place. So I don't know. I'm skeptical that you could actually come up with a scenario where you have informed philosophers and scientists and they aren't, or they are actually coming to a disagreement here.
Yeah, I suppose the thought experiment was more to differentiate on which one is more authoritative if a topic like that ever arose. Because, like, again, I think you're right. I don't really have a topic in mind where they disagree that adamantly to where the majority of philosophers would agree something that's completely opposed to the majority of scientists. I'm sure they're out there, but it's more of a question of which one is authoritative with the evidence being equal. And I don't know if you have, like, an answer to that.
If you have a scenario where you have self-proclaimed philosophers on one side and self-proclaimed scientists on the other, and they end up with a disagreement, my inclination would be to trust the scientists.
That's very interesting coming from a philosopher.
I mean, so there's a type of armchair philosophy that gets divorced from reality, and I think they can just miss things. So it's if you don't have the type of philosophy that's integrated with the science, and you can have a separate team on that issue, then I'd be skeptical of the philosophers. Now, so you certainly can have scientists that make philosophical claims that are obviously wrong and bad, or interpret the science in a bad way. But yeah, I think I would generally trust the scientist if that was how reality shook out.
Okay. And yeah, and in the example, just for clarification, it's not like self-proclaimed scientists or self-proclaimed philosophers. It's like actual bona fide philosophers and expert scientists. Like we're trying to make them have equal credentials, so to speak.
Yeah.
But I think that is a definitely a good answer in the sense that you could pick either one and it would be a good answer because they're both evidenced. But why wouldn't you appeal to something like their which one's more fundamental? Like I don't. Would you agree that you couldn't do science without philosophy? Therefore, philosophy is more fundamental, and therefore the more authoritative discipline.
I mean, I agree. Science really just is philosophy. If you're doing it right, then there's no real difference between those two things. I think the issue is that if you think of philosophy as fundamental and you think of it as like wholly other, you can end up with those armchair philosophers that say a lot of things that are divorced from reality. I think that historically has happened, and therefore that's something that we should be worried about being a possibility in the future, is that they aren't really, you're making conclusions about, like Plato might talk about what it would be like if a bird was to fly in outer space, and he would have no clue. If not grounded, he needs the boots on the ground scientific things to inform his philosophy. Otherwise, he's going to go totally off the rails. So as long as you're not the kind of philosopher that's doing that, then you can dodge that problem.
Yeah, no, completely agree. Which is why, like in the thought experiment, it's like they both have evidence and they're both credentialed and they're not making claims outside of their respected fields. But anyway, no, I appreciate that. That's very interesting. So, how do you handle situations where your emotions would pull you in one direction, but your intellect would pull you in another direction? How would you differentiate between the two? And in that instance, which one would be a more authoritative?
All right. Historically, I have thought of myself. I went through a phase where I was basically like a logic robot, really downplayed emotions, and got really interested in just following whatever's logical. Not the best move for being a good partner in a relationship, but that was my default operating status. So I want to say, oh, reason just trumps everything, and then that's what governs the ship. I want to make a caveat here because the older I get, the more I realize that reason is an ad hoc explanation that we often add to the end of the step and give credit for all of the work when it's not actually the case. So there's a whole bunch of things in life that we claim are the product of reason, and yet reason's not actually driving the ship. There are so many examples of this with regards to like we we claim to know how to ride a bike intellectually, and yet we can ride a bike, but our intellectual explanation of how is wrong. Or to give a really powerful example, when you show someone a trolley problem, we will come up with a rational explanation for why we chose the answer we did. And you can actually realize subconsciously we're appealing to a doctrine called the doctrine of double effect. It's a subconscious principle, and we articulate it explicitly incorrectly. So we are governed by forces that we do not understand. And in fact, we actively misunderstand. And yet, at the end of the day, reason gets all of the credit. So I am more skeptical than I've ever been that reason is actually governing the ship the most of the time. But it certainly feels as if reason is what's governed the ship. And it feels as if reason is what we should try to govern the ship with. So I'm not sure how well I actually answered your question there, but a little bit of a tangent.
No, I like it. If like the reason that we presuppose is the, I don't know, motivating factor behind our decisions, even though it's likely emotional, and if our reason and emotion are determined by things outside of us, then who is really steering the ship, so to speak? Like if it's not our rationality because it's emotions, and if it's not really our emotions because it's governed by other things, how does that like work out?
I think we're actually mostly governed by instincts. That's a huge play in the way we make decisions and the way we govern our lives. But that you should try to govern your life by reason. That's the goal, the philosopher's goal, so to speak. Even in something like I really enjoy jujitsu, right? And having an intellectual understanding of how the individual movements work and how your body weight should be positioned is great. But at the top level, sometimes people will explain their actions wrong. So you'll have a black belt that you know is really good at arm bars, and when they go explain how to do it, they explain it incorrectly, and they tell you to put your weight in the wrong spot. That thing that they don't do in practice, they do it differently, but consciously, their mind has the wrong view of it. So they're kind of governed by this tacit, instinctive understanding. Um, but if they want to teach somebody else, it needs to be governed by reason. Then they need their reason to come in line.
So, if a person's reason or beliefs or emotions are governed by their external factors like culture or upbringing or genetics, how can they authoritatively say what is true or not? Because again, it doesn't seem like that individual is really driving the ship. It seems like it's almost just random wherever their genetics or upbringing brought them, they're going to be determined to believe or say a certain thing.
Yeah. So, I mean, the debate between determinism versus indeterminism, or like free will versus determinism, this is where we start to get into these categories. Um, I think human beings are, the reason does play a role, and that's the one we kind of have the most control over. So that's the one that gets all the attention. So reason is what you should try to govern your life by, and how you should evaluate your decisions. I just think that a lot of times it gets more credit than it actually, the role it actually played.
So, since you brought up like free will, determinism, indeterminism slash compatibilism, and fatalism, and things like that, which one would you identify as?
I'm closer to the free will team. So historically, a recent thing that's happened in philosophy is that this position called compatibilism is now the dominant position among actual philosophers. So determinism is this idea that everything's caused by external factors. Free will is really hard for any of them to agree on the definition of, but it involves us making decisions on our own that we're totally responsible for. And then compatibilists come in the middle and they're like, yeah, everything's determined, but somehow you still have free will. Compatibilism is a tricky position to grasp, and there's a lot of different variations of it, but it now is the most popular one. I probably technically end up being some sort of compatibilist. But I do, in the way that I talk and speak and interact, I sound like a person that's just on the classic free will position.
What would be your evidence for compatibilism?
I think a lot of people, well, if I have a definition of free will that isn't libertarian free will, I probably end up by default into the compatibilist position. And my actual stance on this is that we experience free will way better than we experience how to define it. And our definitions for our attempts at defining it are often going to fall short. And instead of calling into question the existence of free will, that just calls into question my ability to define it. And I think this happens over and over and over again. Like, this is that distinction between our rational ability to articulate what's happening and then the kind of direct experience we have with the thing. So Plato has the funniest example of this. He's like, yeah, I know what people are. People, mankind, are folks that have broad fingernails. And we're featherless bipeds. And then, so originally he says we're featherless bipeds, and then you have a guy pluck a chicken and throw it and say, behold a man. So then he changes his definition to say, yeah, we're featherless bipeds that don't have talons. Right? And what he's doing here is he knows what a man is. He just sucks at defining it. Like, he just defines it by the traits we all have in common. So he might have started off with saying human beings are creatures that have thumbs until he discovers raccoons, and then he's got to go change his definition. I think that's how we come across, that's how we do morality, right? We know that right and wrong exists. And then you say, well, why is it wrong to murder? And somebody says, because it causes pain. So then someone else says, oh, pain's the definition of what makes a thing evil. And then we just come up with examples where that's not the case and we have to go back to scratch. We're really bad at defining the thing we experienced. So defining free will, difficult. Defining good and evil, difficult. Experiencing free will or experiencing morality, very basic and I think available to all folks. And yet when we challenge people's definitions, they end up becoming skeptical to challenge the whole concept of free will or the concept of morality entirely.
Do you have any beliefs that you intellectually disbelieve despite your emotions? Like, you would want something to be true, but intellectually it's not true and you would have to argue against it?
Yes, I'm quite sure that's the case. Can I try and give a variation of that answer that kind of flips the script a bit?
Sure.
So there's an intellectual belief. Like, I believe human beings are responsible for our actions. Like, when I do an action, in fact, I experience moral responsibility. Like, when I do an evil action, I know that I am responsible for that. But if determinism is true, there's a classic argument that ends up concluding that moral responsibility is an illusion. So you can't have moral responsibility if determinism is true. Well, Peter Van Inwagen, happens to be a Christian guy, writes a book on free will. He gives the inverse of that dilemma, and it's very powerful. He says, if indeterminism is true, so determinism is where all of your actions have an external source. If indeterminism is true, that means all of your actions are random. If they're truly not determined by any other thing, they're as good as random. That's indeterminate. Indeterminate actions are random, and therefore you're not responsible for those either. So if determinism is true, you're not responsible for your actions. If indeterminism is true, you're not responsible for your actions. And yet, I'm more confident that you're responsible for your actions than I am for Peter's argument against having responsibility, or the determinist argument against having responsibility. Like, I experience that moral responsibility is a thing more certainly than I do against the two arguments against moral responsibility that I see no problems with.
Yeah, if I recall correctly, Peter Van Inwagen is a Platonist, and he's definitely a Platonist about numbers. I would need to read his work on freedom, free will and things. But yeah, there is a classic thought experiment just to say that both determinism and free will, ultimately, it's either you're determined or it's random. But doesn't that seem just like begging the question that it automatically excludes free will or even compatibilism in that sense? Like, if everything is truly random, which I don't know if you really agree with or not, then how can you have moral responsibility?
Well, I see no way. If it is truly random, I don't see how you'd have moral responsibility. I also don't see how you'd have moral responsibility if everything's truly determined. It seems like um, for something to be, we are influenced by outside factors to some extent. So it's not indeterminate, but maybe those things that are influencing my will are what I call my will in the first place. It's like Peter does believe in free will. He just doesn't define it as libertarian free will. It's he actually finds some difficulty in defining it at all. And I think that's actually the most honest position, is we have a hard time defining the thing that we experience. Because ultimately, every time you try and come up with a label for something, you're making it up. Like if I find a rhino, I'm going to start saying, oh, it's big and gray and has a horn. And then if I find a rhino that has two horns, I'm going to say, oh, it's a big gray thing with one or two horns. And then I find a brown one and I'm like, oh, I'm going to constantly keep tweaking this definition. That's kind of how we do with free will as well. We're trying to explain the thing we have and give it traits and what makes it unique. And it's when you come up with counterexamples, we have to modify our definition because we're really bad at accurately defining something that we experience.
Yeah, that seems just to be the problem with language, that our descriptions of something, they don't necessarily determine what the thing is or isn't. It's just our lack of description for something. But going back to things just being random, so like let me put on my determinist hat real quick. The determinist would say that you can still have repercussions for people's actions. It would just be pragmatic, like it would just be for utility. It wouldn't actually be a justification, or it wouldn't be retributive justice for their punishment. It would just be more of a pragmatic thing, like, oh, this person has been determined to harm others, therefore I will isolate this person. So what do you think of like a determinist argument, like if they went down that road?
Oh yeah, pragmatically, you could be fine. In fact, it's just like actions should have consequences, and those consequences will make a better society. So yeah, the determinists can definitely do those kind of things. What they have trouble with is holding them like actually morally responsible, and say like they did this thing and deserve punishment or something along those lines.
So, like, as a compatibilist, what would be your answer to get around the quote unquote like randomness objection? To say that both sides just devolve into randomness. Like, what is the thing that keeps you being a compatibilist given that dilemma, which is either unsolved or you have an answer?
So let's take for granted that the determinist argument is impeccable and that the indeterminist argument is impeccable. And both of them, so no matter whether you get heads or tails, you end up at the conclusion that free will is an illusion and that moral responsibility doesn't exist. So in that view, in indeterminism, there really is no free will and there's no moral responsibility. And in determinism, there really is no free will and there's no moral responsibility. Well, I experience free will and moral responsibility more directly than I have reason to trust my own acceptance of the rather complicated arguments in favor of determinism or indeterminism, rejecting free will and rejecting moral responsibility. So ironically there, I think if I'm supposed to trust something, my experience with ability to make choices is more foundational than my ability to appraise either one of those arguments.
But if the argument is valid and sound, wouldn't it just mean that your intuitions or your experiences are also just predetermined? Like, it sounds like you're just leaning into the dilemma in one sense. Well, because of my experience, therefore I'm going to do X, but because that was already predetermined, that would just be evidence for determinism.
I think it's more like my ability to determine sound arguments is utilizing something, right? Rational faculty or something like that. My I can be mistaken in those things. Like I can't say for certain that the determinist argument is sound and the indeterminist argument is also sound. I'm using my reason to reach that conclusion. I can tell you that it's a validly structured argument, and I can tell you that I don't see a problem with either of the premises. So it certainly seems like it would be a sound argument. But my confidence that I can say either of those arguments is sound is less than the confidence I should have that free will is a thing.
Let's move back to morality real quick. And if something is morally right in a particular culture, but it's against your worldview, how would you solve that tension?
So I don't think it makes sense to say morally right in a particular culture. I think there's just morally right and not. You can have some cultural variance in the same sense that I could have variance in that my household, you're not allowed to have a cookie before dinner because the cookie maker said so. And if you do it, you're basically stealing cookies. Right? And in your household, maybe there is no such rule. So you can have differences there, but there's still a same moral principle even in both of our households, and that principle is you're not allowed to steal from the person's property or something like that, or you're supposed to respect authority. So it's really the same underlying rules, and they're manifest differently, or they have different like applications, different exceptions or nuances. So modesty might be a rule that applies cross-culturally, and yet how you define modesty is going to greatly depend upon how hot your culture is. If you're from a super hot culture, perhaps you're more likely to show some skin. And if you're from a different culture, you might have an association that the calf is really a sexual organ and therefore is something you're not allowed to reveal. So there's some nuances to be had culturally, but I don't think I'm not a cultural relativist. I don't think that cultures get to determine what's good and bad. So it's entirely possible that you just have cultures that reach the wrong conclusions. And almost all of our moral disagreements are actually factual disputes at the heart of it. So when you have people that are pro or anti-abortion arguing with each other, they often disagree about whether or not a fetus has personhood. In the Holocaust, you have German people convinced that the Jews are subhuman. In pro-slavery cultures, you're convinced that the people you're enslaving don't count as persons. The Yanomami people might engage in cannibalism because the word Yanomami means human, and they think that the people they're eating don't count. Right? So these are all factual disputes that underlie these apparent moral disagreements. Or the Salem witch trials, the fact that they believe those women are witches is what's causing them to engage in this aberrant behavior that we would think is crazy. So it's factual disputes lend to the apparent disagreements in morality. And that's where a lot of the cultural differences, I think, ultimately stem from.
There's two things definitely I would like you to clarify or give me more information on. So I like the cookie example that you gave because you extrapolated that stealing in both households are wrong. It seems that I could just change the scenario to say, yeah, in one household, you're not allowed to have cookies past, I don't know, 5 o'clock. And in the other household, all cookies are banned. They're all wrong. So in that sense, you're not extrapolating just to stealing. It's literally completely a different type of ideology attached to why something is wrong. So if your worldview made that extrapolation and said all X is, boo X, or all X is bad, or evil, I should say, I shouldn't say bad. And then a culture says, no, X is good. How would you approach that culture?
Well, I'd want to know why they come to the conclusion that they do. And I think a lot of reasons is going to end up being your worldview leads to a different factual claim about reality. So if certain meats are unclean, there's a really good, it's a really likely case that those meats in your culture prepared a certain way will be unhealthy, would have killed people, or something along those lines. Like there's a underlying belief about the world that's going to lead you to that conclusion. Or it could be that it's just a false belief, and you think that the only way that you can bring the harvest is by sacrificing a virgin's heart on the altar. Right? So if that God isn't real and that sacrifice doesn't work, then you wouldn't have held that belief. So perhaps we share some underlying moral principles we agree on, and it's the differences in beliefs about how the world works, about whether or not sacrifices are efficacious to do what they're claiming to do, whether or not the outsider is a real person. Like those are the things that are really driving our moral disagreements.
I'll ask one more question about this, and then I want to move on to the personhood argument for abortion that you brought up. Let's say your worldview says one thing and the culture says another thing. Would it be appropriate for you to enforce your worldview and say that the culture is just demonstrably wrong? Or would you have to say, well, the culture must be right and my worldview must be wrong? Like, which one is more authoritative?
Even if we take totally for granted that our worldview is the one that's informed by the correct facts and their worldview is the wrong one, it doesn't even necessarily mean that I should go impose my worldview on them and make them believers onto me. Like historically, we did that a lot. Anthropology classes will call it ethnocentrism and claim like that's the boogeyman approach. Like that's colonialism type stuff where we're imposing our values on other people. And that was a lot of what my anthropology classes centered around. It's possible that intervening is the right thing to do. There's a historic case in New Guinea where there was a practice where it involved, because of their belief system, they had some really backward scientific beliefs, and it involved sexually assaulting children repeatedly, particularly the males. They thought that that was like the rite of passagehood into manhood, that you wouldn't be able to produce your own semen. You'd never be fertile unless you went through this ritualistic abuse. And I mean, we did literally, as other countries go, impose our values on that culture, stop them from engaging in that behavior. But I do think there's a difference between saying one culture is closer to the truth on a particular topic and then being able to reach the conclusion, therefore I should impose my views on them or make them behave like I behave.
I'll jump to the second one now. I do want to keep going down that, but I don't. Quickly, I got to talk to a Harvard grad who's a lawyer about the personhood argument for abortion. It's up on the channel, and I'm curious about, like, could you flesh that out more for like people who are listening? Like, why would that be important, and on your view?
So, not every debate about abortion boils down to this particular issue, but there is one scientific claim that underlies a lot of the disagreement, and that is, does a fetus have personhood or not? And it tends to be the case that if you think that a fetus has personhood, you're way more reluctant to do anything that harms or ends the life of the fetus, because we tend to think that hurting people needs a really good justification, a really good reason. If you view the fetus as a clump of cells that is not a person, and you don't ascribe to it any of the things that personhood entails, it's very much easier to justify doing actions that terminate the life of the fetus. So one of the big debates between is abortion good or is abortion bad, or is abortion acceptable or is abortion not acceptable, would depend upon, I could almost predict your position based on whether I know your belief about the status of a fetus with relation to personhood.
Two quick things. I would like you to predict my position, because I don't think you would be able to. So I do want you to do that, but I wanted to ask something before that. You said it's a scientific question that determines whether or not a fetus has personhood. What's the justification for that? Because it seems to be a purely philosophical question.
Um, Perhaps instead of saying scientific, I should have said there's an objectively correct answer to this. Just like 99% of the things that we look at with regards to what's objective or not are scientific questions. For a lot of people, what they define personhood as, like, and historically we're awful at doing this. So I feel like this is just as ad hoc as when Plato says people are ones that have are featherless bipeds. So I think our initial guesses to this are as full of holes as Plato was back then. We're just a little bit further down the line in history. But they'll come up with answers as to what personhood has. They'll say, like, oh, it's your ability to reason. Well, if it's your ability to reason, like a Kantian style understanding of being able to reason and have the understanding the categorical imperative and all that kind of stuff, well, that puts your value as a person only once you're, like, I don't know, 8. Right? So it discounts the value of all the people below that age, and means therefore you could kill them without any kind of problem. Or maybe you put it as, okay, it's the ability to have a concept of self. And then that, okay, well, now 2-year-olds and under are fair game, don't have any value. Or maybe you say, oh, it's the ability to feel pain and pleasure. Well, now I can point towards a specific trimester in which pain and pleasure is available. And I can say anything younger than that has no value. Anything older than that has value. But whatever I end up defining has huge implications as to who counts as a person and who doesn't. And whoever ends up on the non-person category, they end up being able to be abused without any moral problems. Historically, we put the definition of personhood at the wrong place, and then that leads to a segment of society that gets abused. So the question is just, like, who's right? And if you identify that you disagree about what that point is, you're probably, or you have way higher odds of having a dispute about the acceptability of abortion or acceptability of treating this person differently.
So what do you think my position is, and what is your position on abortion?
Do you put personhood at conception?
I wanted you to try to predict what my position is. Like, you can investigate me,
Oh, I see.
but just like to go flat out, I want you to make a guess, and I would be shocked if you got the answer correctly.
Okay. Well, given that I know you already have some nuanced views about philosophy and are willing to have a controversial position like rejecting free will, I'm gonna assign to you a rather nuanced position. I'm gonna say you think personhood happens sometime early in pregnancy, but that you don't know for sure, and tend to err on the side of caution when it comes to terminating a fetus. That's my initial guess.
Okay, and then what is your position on abortion? And then I'll give an answer.
So my position is, um, I I advocate circumstantial ethics in every case. I think that circumstances always matter. There's going to be relevant factors, and that literally, I think everyone does this. So even the folks that think they're absolutist, I think the word absolutist means nothing other than the word objective. It never adds to the word objective morality in any way, is only detrimental. And that even the folks who think circumstances don't matter end up violating that rule immediately. Because if you say murder is wrong, you try to stay that as absolutist. Murder is already killing within a specific set of circumstances. So you're already baking in circumstances into the question. So I think no one is an absolutist. Circumstances totally matter. And I think you can have relevant circumstances as to why you might consider ending the life of a fetus, and irrelevant ones. So if I'm just doing it to preserve my beach body or something like that, that seems like a really weak reason. And if instead I'm having suicidal thoughts and I conceived out of rape and it's really affecting my self perspective, your justification is much stronger than the person who just wants to preserve the beach body or something like that. So these are nuanced, difficult decisions that have morally relevant factors all across the board. I don't think personhood starts at conception. I think if it did, there's actually some really ironic, weird, crazy implications of that. I think it's definitely post implantation and probably a good deal after that. Um, but I don't actually know what the answer is. And I am very hesitant to risk killing another person without really exceptionally good reasons. So the longer it goes, the more significant the justification I would think you need to be confident you are morally acceptable in terminating a fetus. So in general, I probably look like just a regular pro-life person. I think that personhood probably happens in the uh, early in terms of weeks, not in terms of conception. Um, and I'm very hesitant to terminate a fetus. I don't necessarily think it should be illegal in all circumstances. And I think that morally, circumstances matter as well, but it's actually very hard to come up with circumstances in where it's obviously good. Sorry if that was a really long winded answer.
No, no, no problem. No, no, I appreciate somebody that will extrapolate their views. So I guess here's the report card. Well, two things I thought was interesting just about passing comments. I'm not a determinist. I was just putting on my determinist hat when we were talking about that.
Fair.
As for personhood, I don't use personhood arguments at all. Like zero. I don't use them at all. I'm completely agnostic about it. So you were right in the withholding judgment that I don't think that that's a necessary part of the formula at all. It would seem that it really just boils down to, do you think human beings have intrinsic value? And if the answer is yes, then that would mean the vast majority of abortions are wrong, and it would also mean that all elective abortions are wrong. But I was interested in what you said about like specific situations. So it sounds like you're pro-life, but you're not a absolutist. But you would see certain circumstances, such as, I don't know, various circumstances, but let's just take rape, for example. What would justify killing an innocent human being if somebody was raped?
I When I mentioned the rape example, what I'm initially really thinking about is legality. I think it's really hard to hold somebody legally accountable for a situation where they are like it's a tough situation. It's understandable that a person would be having trouble staying hooked up and fostering this life within them when that's the situation it's born into. As to That doesn't mean I think it'd be morally good to terminate the fetus. I don't know. It becomes so nuanced and complex once you get into a situation like that. It's hard to actually put yourself in that person's shoes and figure out what the all the ramifications are. I do think if you become really specific and you say like, killing non-consenting people for fun is wrong, then it'd be obvious that, oh, there's at least one circumstance where abortion is completely unacceptable, and that is if you're doing it just for fun. But in reality, people's reasons are more complicated than that.
So yeah, I suppose like two things there. The first one is what would be the justification that would motivate somebody to morally be allowed to kill an innocent human being for convenience, even if they were raped, which is awful, obviously. Like, obviously, those circumstances are just awful full through. It's going to be very mentally difficult and mentally taxing. You mentioned two side comments. I just want to have proper framing. You said hooked up to them. Hooked up almost like requires like external like tubes and things, but this is a very natural thing. This is not quote unquote hooked up to something as if it's external to yourself. This is something your body naturally does. So I don't think hooked up would be proper framing. And it also seems that particularly when somebody refers to the human being in the womb as it. But I don't think that we should refer to human beings as its overall. So I guess what would be the justification, even in regards to something as terrible as rape? What would be the justification to terminate an innocent human being?
If you get really specific and you say like, why can you terminate an innocent human being? And then you say like for convenience, you're already making it so specific that it's like only referencing like elective abortions and is therefore really hard to argue against. If you're going to argue for when it is acceptable to do something like an abortion, it's easiest to argue for if you don't have that specificity. And this is where people always go, by the way. If you bring up pro-life at all, they're like, well, what about if the mother's life is in danger? Like that's the most obvious, easy example of where you would be pro-choice in that if the life of a mother's in danger, it's literally self-defense, right? So self-defense is much easier to justify than it is killing people for fun or killing people for convenience or killing people to preserve a beach body or something like that. So it would be highlighting the most likely case. It would be hard for me to try and come up with examples that are closer to preserve the beach body example and then conclude that it's still good. I think it's difficult. I can see why it'd be pragmatic. I can see why it would be reasonable given a person's mental state or something. But to say that it's good, tricky. To say that it's not something we should make illegal, that would be easier. But yeah, difficult to conclude that it's actually good.
Yeah, I totally agree that these are very difficult things to talk about. It's difficult to determine as well in most instances, but I wanted to specifically talk about just the rape situation since it was brought up. Like in that particular situation, what would justifiably motivate somebody to make a correct moral action towards another human being to where they are killed?
So, and you might have guessed this by the hooked up terminology. I was referencing a particular objection that's rather common. It's this idea that that pregnancy is akin to being hooked up to another person via, I think it was the kidneys, and you have this relationship where you have 9 months and you're keeping this violinist alive who you're hooked up to, and you didn't mean to hook up, but now someone's hooked you up, and you have to determine whether you let them die or whether you stay for the 9 months and end up letting them have a fruitful life. And that was a classic counterexample that tried to show that unplugging is not so bad. Now, I have a bunch of problems with that counterexample. One of the main ones being that we aren't hooked up in our sleep against our will to a random violinist. This is an act that's done through sex, and we know the consequences of it are to have potentially a pregnancy result. The rape example is much closer to the example that we gave earlier, where you're hooked up against your will to the violinist and then have to decide whether you keep him alive or not. So if there's any ambiguity to argue that that it would be more acceptable in that circumstance, I think it would be much more persuasive and have much more in common with that classic violinist counterexample than with the standard method of having a pregnancy.
I'm very familiar with the violinist example, and I'm glad that we agree that the parallels completely break down. And you are correct that in regards to the rape situation, it is closer. But I guess I would still need to hear like the justification for it, right? I just got a description of it, but I didn't get the justification for why you can morally do it. You brought up legality as well. Let's throw legality completely out the window because we've had laws for slavery and things. So just because something's legal doesn't make it moral. I think the moral question is far more pressing about it. So what would make in regards to if somebody was raped, which again is awful, what would make them morally justified to kill an innocent human being?
Like the question becomes, if you're holding a person who's dangling off the edge of a cliff, are you able to let go? Like, letting go is going to end up killing them, but currently they're holding onto your arm and you can't go to work and you are going to be stuck and you're not going to be able to do the things you want to do as long as you're holding on to this person. Uh, is it so? The morally correct action seems to be like you should hang on and keep them alive, but are you obligated to hang on and keep them alive, especially if you're not the one that reached out to grab them in the first place? Like, I can see the case that someone would try and make, and it's a more compelling case than the case of trying to preserve the beach body or something along those lines. Like, you can come up with much worse reasons. I'm not sure it ultimately passes that you have a moral ability to let go and still be blameless, but it's definitely an easier case to make.
I can agree with you. Of sure. I don't. I think I just got like more descriptions. I didn't get like an answer. Maybe you're just agnostic, I suppose, on that particular scenario. But I'll ask you a question and it will help me clarify if that's okay. Do you think it's okay to punish the innocent for the crimes of the guilty?
I do not.
Okay. So if we apply that to the rape situation, what what do you think we can deduce?
I think a person who's actually in that scenario is perhaps doing something closer to self-preservation. Like, how can you live with, like, I don't know. I think there's going to be significant trauma involved, or at least can be significant trauma involved in a thing like that, where you now have to have this thing growing inside of you and you didn't want it and you didn't ask for it. And like, I understand the appeal and the ways that they might argue. I'm not willing to be like, yes, it's obviously morally good, but I can certainly see the complexity there. Certain things in morality are obvious, like the killing non-consenting people solely for fun is wrong. Easy one. You can make more complicated ones where the conclusions aren't so obvious. And I think this is definitely a harder question than the previous one. So I'm not super confident to say that it's, I'm not confident at all to say that it's good. I'm not sure I'd also be super confident to say, oh yeah, it's obviously evil at all times. If it was just punishing the child, like, oh, I'm mad at the child because of what the father did, then clearly it's bad. But I don't think that would be their actual reasoning. I think it'd be more nuanced than that.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a direct punishment, but obviously the child would be receiving the, I don't know, the punishment that maybe should be on the father in that sense. Like it seems like blame is being passed, and the I don't think a victim should make other victims if that clears up that position specifically.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm very interested. So based on your answers, and you can just remain agnostic. That's totally fine as well on that. And again, like I totally agree. It's just terrible that this happens at all anyway. You were alluding to something earlier that if something, you said something, I would say someone, because again, I want proper framing that it's still a human being. So I don't want to call human beings things. That if somebody is uncomfortable or gives somebody mental anguish or they have to be with somebody for a certain amount of time, I'm having a hard time, if you can explain to me, the justification morally that that would be okay to take their life. Like if I broke up with somebody or somebody got divorced, I can understand that that would be mental anguish and you'd still have to live with them in the meantime while the divorce is going on. You wouldn't have to, but some people do. I don't think that raises justification to take a life, though. So I would like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah. I mean, in the scenario where if I'm pregnant and raped, and in that scenario, I would hope that I would preserve the life. I certainly have understanding for a person that might make a different decision. If you're talking about like moral ways to try and make it justifiable, then things like, um, so I don't want to go too big into the doctrine of double effect, but essentially there's a concept that doing something directly is worse than doing it indirectly. Like when you're getting an abortion, I think that if people are trying to not be pregnant from their rapist, they're not thinking, oh, I want to kill this thing inside me. They're thinking, oh, I don't want to be pregnant anymore. And as a byproduct, you end up terminating the life of the fetus in that scenario. But I don't think that's actually their goal. Now, you can make a lot of moral philosophies don't care about that distinction of like what happens versus what you were trying to happen. But there's a good number of moral philosophies that do. So it depends on which team you're actually on as to whether that justification makes any relevance whatsoever. But it tends to be that people think bombing the bad guys and accidentally hitting the baker is more acceptable than bombing the baker directly, right? Or throwing the baker at the bad guy seems like a different type of thing. So there might be some wiggle room morally if your goal is not to actually hurt the fetus, but is to do something like preserve your own mental faculties or not be reminded every day of what happened to you.
How is what you said, how does that map on to the event and the rape scenario? Because it doesn't seem like, oh, an innocent bystander got killed because of something else. It literally seems like the intent of the abortion is to kill the innocent human being. It's like the bomb was supposed to kill the baker in that scenario. And I don't think you would agree with that morality that motivates that. So I'll let you have the last word on that.
Yeah, some of the methods definitely seem to directly attack the fetus as opposed to, I mean, some of them are just like, it changes the way the womb works and then the womb's unhospitable to the fetus and the fetus ends up dying. And then some are more directly like we go in and pull the child out. And like, so the method might have something to do with it. But I think the actual reasoning for at least the women in scenarios like that are I mean, maybe some of them are like, I hate the fetus and I don't want it to be inside of me. But I think there's going to be a lot of situations where that's not what they're thinking, where they're wanting to, like, they're solely concerned about getting their life back and avoiding the trauma of feeling the way it makes them feel or something along those lines. And then it's like an accidental byproduct that the fetus ends up being, its life ended. That's my suspicion anyway.
Yeah, no, I thank you. And like, I want to be respectful of your time, so I don't have any more questions. But I really appreciate this conversation and you going through and answering all of those. I think it's awesome that you've taught philosophy for so long, that you're interested in these things. You're asking the big questions. And I just really appreciate that. So thank you so much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.